So today we're going to go over how to use formulas inside of Excel. So what we've started with is we have a column for a bunch of different items with specific masses that we already know. And our physics teacher wants us to know what the gravitational force is for each of these items. So what we're going to do is a formula using the mass column and multiplying it by 9.81. That's the gravitational acceleration. So we do 5 times 9.81. And that gets us 49.05. So if you wanted, you could type that formula in all of these different cells and just type in this value here. Or what you can do is what's called cell referencing. So you do equals and then you select the cell you want to reference and then multiply it by 9.81. And you can drag that down. And so it's going to multiply the column C value by 9.81. Another thing you can do is using cell referencing again is reference the C column and this value over here, which we've already said is 9.81. And then you can autofill that down. However, you would need to either statically reference it by putting dollar signs in front of the values, or you could rename the cell. So if we start by putting dollar signs in front of the value, it's going to statically reference this A2 cell, even though it's changing the C cell that it's referencing. So if we wanted to name this cell, we could select it and then go up here to where it says A2 and type G for gravity. So then we go back over here and instead of typing A2, we would type G. And it already knows to reference this cell over here because we already named it. And then we can autofill that down and it'll stay referencing G. If you want to change this reference, you need to go up to formulas and go to name manager. And this is where you can edit them or delete them, add a new one if you want, and change which cell it refers to. And that's how you can use formulas with cell referencing in Excel. Another thing that you can do in Excel is use functions. So there are 6 functions that we're going to go over that you need to know for class. However, if you want to look up any other functions that Excel has, you can go up to this sigma sign here and go to more functions. And it'll show a bunch of different types of functions that Excel offers. And you can sort them if you want. You can type a description and it'll try to figure out which function you're looking for, things like that. So it's very helpful if you're trying to do something but you're not really sure how to use it. So a function is similar to something that you've learned in math class, which is you have x and y is the function of x. So it's not the same as a formula because formulas use typical operators like adding, subtracting, multiplying, things like that. Whereas functions, although they can involve formulas or be involved in a formula, a function itself is not a formula. So a function is like, for instance, the sum function allows you to add a range of cells, just like that. So it sums up all of them, and that's what its function is. And then the average function finds the average of the selected range. And then we have the min function, which will find the smallest number in a range, and the max function, which will find the largest number in a range. The next function is the count function. The count function allows you to count how many numbers are in your range, which we have 9. And the next function is count A, which similar to count will count numbers, but will also count letters or non-numerical data within your range. So if we only select the number range, it's going to be the same as count. However, if I were to go up here and change the range to include the first 2 cells, it will have 11. So if I went up here and changed count to be F1 to F11, it'll still say the number 9. And I didn't go over this in the other video, but if you want to autofill something, you can find this little green box in the corner. It might not be green on your version, it's green on my version, and select it and drag it to whichever you're trying to autofill. So for instance, I want to use these functions on all of these formulas. So I can select all of these functions and then go over and it'll find the average, minimum, maximum, count, and count A for all of those cells. One of the things that you'll need to know in Excel is how to use conditional logic. So earlier we went over how to use functions, and conditional logic is just more advanced functions. So instead of just having sum these things, find the average of these things, and so on, you're going to use logic to tell Excel to do something. So we'll start with an if statement. This is the most basic conditional logic that you can use in Excel. So you're going to start off by typing equals if, and then you'll notice that it says the things that you need to include in your if statement. So we're going to, let's say, ask if this is greater than 30. And if it's true, we want it to say something. So if it's greater than 30, let's say that it's heavy. So you need to include quotation marks around the word that you're writing, and that's going to be the true value. So if it's false, let's say that it's light. And then if we press enter, it'll tell us that it's heavy. If I change this value from 30 to say 50, it'll say that it's light. Typically you use conditional logic in more of a nested if statement. So you want to know if multiple things are held true, and then you can tell Excel to do something with that information. So similar to an if statement, you start off by typing equals if, and then you're going to have some logic. So let's use this value in C4, which is 58.86. And we're going to see if it's less than 50. And we're going to tell it that that's going to be something that's light. Then if it's greater than or equal to 50, we'll see just how heavy it is. So we're going to ask it again, but we're going to ask it if it's greater than 80. If that's true, then it's really heavy. Otherwise, it's just heavy. And then we're going to close both of those if statements. So we're asking if C4 at first is less than 50. If that's true, then it's light. We don't have to worry about the rest of the if statement. If that's not true, then we're going to see if it's greater than 80. And if that is true, then it's really heavy. If neither of these first statements are true, so it's not less than 50 and not greater than 80, then it's just heavy. So it's somewhere in between 50 and 80. And so since it is, 58.86 is greater than 50, but less than 80, then it's considered that middle region, which is heavy. And so that's how you do a nested if statement. For a sum if statement, you start by typing equals sum if. And then you're going to select a range that you're going to apply criteria for. So we're going to see if the mass is greater than 11. And you need to put these in quotation marks because it involves a non-numerical character, so it's going to freak out if you don't put quotation marks right there. And if it is greater than 11, then I want it to sum up the force values. If I don't select another range that I want to add up, then it's going to automatically assume that I'm adding the original range that the criteria was checked with. I don't want to add up the mass range. I want to add up the force range. And so I'm going to click enter, and the sum of the values where the mass is greater than 11 is 794.61. Now I could do the same thing with count, so equals count if. However, this one doesn't give me the option to differentiate between the range that I'm applying the criteria to and the range that I'm trying to count. In this case, it doesn't really matter. You don't need to have two ranges because if you had a separate range, it's going to do the same thing anyway. The number that you're counting is going to be the same. So I'm going to select this range like I did with the sum if and ask if it's greater than 11. And then I'm going to set that. And so that's going to be 5. There are 5 mass values that are greater than 11. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so those were the force values that were added earlier when we did the sum if statement. Another way you can use conditional logic is by using and or. So the way this works is you're going to ask Excel whether or not multiple conditions are true. And it's just going to let you know if it's true or false. So in this case, I want to know if the day column equals Thursday. And I also want to know if the weather was rainy. Okay, enter. That was false. So what I can do is I can autofill this down, and none of that was true. So it checked to see if both of these conditions were true. Since neither of them were in all of the situations, all of these were false. However, if I did the same thing with the or, so let's copy this, and instead of using and, we're going to use or. So this lets you know if either of these conditions are true. So it's not Sunday and it's not rainy. But if I go down, two cells say true. So that's because it went to check to see if either of these conditions were true. So it was either Thursday in the day column or rainy in the G column. And in this case, it was rainy. So that's why it said true. Down here at J6, it said that it was true because in the day column, it did say Thursday, whereas in the weather column, since it said thunderstorm, that would have been false. But since at least one of these conditions were met, the output was true. And so that's how you use conditional logic.